Okay, good afternoon, everybody. We are happy to be hosting Paul Ziemann from the University of Colorado. Paul did his undergraduate work at the University of Connecticut, and then he got his PhD at Penn State, and then he did a postdoc with Peter McMurray in University of Minnesota, and then he spent quite a few years at UC Riverside, and then he joined the faculty at CU about 4 years ago. So we'll welcome Paul and look forward to a good talk.
Okay, thanks, John. And thanks to all of you for coming today. I'm going to talk about sort of a... Oops. Okay. All right. Yeah. All right, so I'm going to... Does that work? Not yet. Let's try this. Can you hear that? No, it works. Okay. So what I'm going to talk about today is sort of what's been a theme of our research for many years, and this talk will draw from work we've done for quite a while, including some more recent things. But as the title here suggests, our interest is in how the molecular structure of organic molecules affects their atmospheric chemistry, in particular, how it affects their tendency to participate in aerosol formation. And so this is work that over the years was done by 3 graduate students here, Yong Lim, April Rani, and Luke Algram, and has been funded through the years by NSF. So the sort of aerosol formation processes that we're interested in might not be of so much interest if the air looked like this everywhere, but this is where I came from, though it was some years later. So this is a picture from Riverside, as it says at the top there, back in the early 70s, way before I was there. But it shows a smog front coming in from Los Angeles. This was the sort of thing that happened every day, apparently, and this is even March, it's not even the summer. And so the kinds of processes we're interested in are the chemistry that's responsible for this smog, in particular the particulate aspect of that. And so I'm going to talk about first a little bit of background, which may not be necessary for this group, but I'll do this on secondary organic aerosol formation and the chemistry involved in that. And then I'll touch on the experimental approach that we use, and in particular I'll point out some of the challenges that are involved with the kinds of experiments that we conduct. And then I'm going to focus on, in particular, alkane chemistry, sort of polluted air reacting with OH and NOx, and then a little bit on some oxygenated products that are formed from that. And so this slide from Jose Jimenez's group a few years ago sort of emphasizes the importance of secondary organic aerosol as a component of the organic matter that's in aerosol, which comprises maybe 50% of the aerosol mass. And if you look then at the oxidized versus the unoxidized forms, you see that in sort of urban areas, you have roughly maybe 2/3 is oxidized organic aerosol, and as you go downwind, it becomes almost fully oxygenated. So our interest is in understanding these processes, and they're basically in chemical detail. And so what we do is we conduct experiments in environmental chamber or smog chamber. This is a Teflon film bag that's about 8 cubic meters, and the processes that go on in there involve the oxidation of an organic compound by either OH, ozone, NO3. Today I'm going to just talk about reactions with hydroxyl radicals. And those reactions lead to the formation of some first-generation products, which can then subsequently, if they stay in the gas phase, can be oxidized further to higher generation, second, third generation, and whatnot. But also some of those products, as they become oxidized, may condense into aerosol particles where they could either undergo further oxidation or undergo sort of heterogeneous multiphase chemistry involving sort of a oligomer formation in these sorts of reactions. And then because we're conducting these reactions in a Teflon film chamber, it turns out that the walls play a significant role in what goes on there. And so a convenient way to sort of think about this chemistry is that molecules react according to two pathways. In one case, they can add functional groups to sort of the carbon backbone, and in that way decrease the volatility, decrease the vapor pressure, and so enhance their tendency to make aerosol. And the other extreme is that carbon-carbon bonds can be broken, which lead to the formation of smaller molecules that tend to be more volatile and would, in most cases, stay in the gas phase. And so we'd like to understand, sort of from a mechanistic perspective, how these pathways can lead to the sort of the enhancement of organic aerosol formation, or sort of small amounts of aerosol formation, depending on how what the molecular structure is and how that affects the subsequent chemistry. And so I'm going to talk a lot about aerosol yields because this is a quantity that's often, I should say, of most often interest to modelers. And it's a convenient way to think about the molecular details as well. And so if we sort of define the aerosol yield, the SOA yield, as the mass of organic matter that's formed relative to the mass of the volatile organic compound that's reacted, that gives us a measure of sort of how efficient the reaction leads to aerosol formation. And one can think of this yield as essentially being affected by there's two contributions to this. One is that as a reaction proceeds, a series of products are formed, and those products all are formed with a certain mass yield. And then there's another term, the second term here, which is fraction in particles, which determines how much of the compound will partition into the particulate phase. And so both the gas phase yield of the compound as well as its volatility, which affects its partitioning, are important in determining the overall yield. And so typically, this is the sort of relationship one will see if you make a series of measurements of the aerosol yield as a function of the concentration of particulate matter, as you'll see an increase, and then a plateau as the mass concentration gets so high that sort of all the components that can partition to the aerosol for a certain range of mass concentrations that one's dealing with will all get in there. And so you see a leveling off of the curve at some point. But these are the sorts of curves that are typically used in models. Okay? And so they say one of the important aspects of that is the aerosol mass. The other important feature is the vapor pressure of the products. And so this table will give you a sense of how different functional groups will affect compound vapor pressures and therefore their tendency to partition in the aerosol. So what's shown here at the top is a C14 alkane, which is a fairly large size molecule to begin with. Its vapor pressure is shown there at 10 to minus 2 torr, and if one uses gas particle partitioning theory and sort of a typical atmosphere, sort of polluted air mass of 10 micrograms per cubic meter, about 1% of that would be present in the particles, so not very much. But as the molecule gets oxidized and these various functional groups are added, carbonyl groups, hydroxyl groups, nitrates, acids, then the vapor pressure decreases. But even what you'll see is even if you get down to acid, which is sort of the most effective functional group in terms of reducing vapor pressure, only about 3% of that compound would be present in the aerosol. It's a very small fraction. And so what one typically sees in practice is that most of the compounds that are present in the particles have multiple functional groups. And so any chemistry that can add multiple functional groups is especially effective at making aerosol. And so the experiments that we do, as I say, are conducted in a Teflon film chamber. We add the organic compound of interest. In this case, what I'll talk about is just some alkanes as well as some experiments with ketones and alcohols. We add some seed particles to serve as a sink for condensation. And then we add methyl nitrite and NO, and we photolyze that with black lights to make hydroxyl radicals. And then we make a a variety of measurements. So we collect the gas phase onto 10x adsorbent and measure the disappearance of the parent compound with gas chromatography. We measure the particle size distribution with a scanning mobility particle sizer, and then we collect filter samples and extract those and do some functional group analysis as well as liquid chromatography. And then we also have a home-built particle mass spectrometer similar to the Aerosol mass spectrometer that you've, I'm sure, seen a lot about. Ours has a few different features to it, though, but similar to the AMS, this is a differentially pumped system, and so the air is drawn through an aerodynamic lens, which focuses the particles into a narrow beam so that they can be efficiently transported to high vacuum. And then they impact on the tip of this copper rod, which is, for real-time analysis, heated to about 160 degrees or so, and so they flash evaporate, and some of the vapor goes up into that mass spectrometer where we just continuously scan and so get mass spectra of the particles as they're forming and evolving in the chamber. And then the other thing that we do with this instrument is to, when an experiment is over, sort of the lights have been turned off, for instance, we turn off the heat to the vaporizer and then just dip the end of this rod into liquid nitrogen to cool it, and then the particles that come in hit the surface and freeze on the surface. And then we can ramp the temperature up at a couple degrees a minute, and the different components then evaporate based on their vapor pressures. And so we can separate components that way to get better mass spectral information, but we can also get information on the vapor pressures of the compounds, because we can essentially calibrate that temperature axis. So it gives us a number of important pieces of information.
Your scan mobility analyzer,
yes.
Do you have any problems with that, or does it work well for you?
Yeah, I mean, we're just using it to measure, particle size distributions. Yeah. And we typically, so we measure, volume distributions with that. If we assume a density, we can come up with an aerosol mass from that. And we compare that with the amount that we collect from filter samples, and those actually tend to agree very well.
Oh, excellent.
Yeah.
What type, do you know what type it is?
The SMPS?
Yes.
It's a home-built version.
Oh, excellent.
Yes, yeah.
Thank you.
But it's very similar to the TSI instrument.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay. And so what I'm going to talk about first is a series of different types of alkanes. And so this includes just linear structures, branch structures, and cyclic ones. And as you likely know, these are important components of urban atmospheres where they make up maybe 50% or so. And they have lifetimes in urban environments of roughly a day or so due to reaction with hydroxyl radicals. And if one looks at the distribution of carbon numbers of these coming out of, say, in diesel trucks, for instance, which is an important source, you'll see things out to maybe C30 or so. And so there's a large range of compounds that can contribute to aerosol. Those that can make aerosol through this photochemistry are likely to be those larger than about, say, C10 or so. Right? They have to have low enough vapor pressure to start with to be able to partition to the aerosol. And so what I want to do is I'm going to go through a little bit of mechanistic detail, but the whole talk will essentially build on this first picture. And so this is just showing the reaction of a linear alkane, which is nice because it forms actually very few products. And so the reaction's initiated by H-atom abstraction by OH to make an alkyl radical, which immediately reacts with O2 to make the peroxy radical. And then in polluted environments where there's an O around, it can either react to make an alkyl nitrate, or it can convert NO to NO2 to make an alkoxy radical. And as you'll see throughout this talk, aerosol yield formation, all the products that are formed are in large part determined by what happens to the alkoxy radicals. And so there's two pathways that are shown here. One is decomposition, which leads to breaking of carbon-carbon bonds. And so it makes lighter molecules that would tend to stay in the gas phase. Or they can isomerize by pulling a hydrogen off further down the carbon chain to add a hydroxyl group and then recreate this alkyl radical site, which then again adds O2, as in the earlier stages. And then this can also react with NO to make hydroxynitrates or go through a series of additional steps to make hydroxycarbonyls. So there's basically three major products that are formed through the gas phase chemistry here. And I should say there's potentially a fourth one, the carbonyls. But so we have alkyl nitrates, hydroxynitrates, carbonyls, and hydroxycarbonyls. And so the first sort of goal of this work was to try to quantify the various products. And there'd been certainly some work done on this, and there's been continued work done by others besides us, but I'll talk about mostly what we've done. And so one of the things that I want to point out right off about doing chamber experiments in these Teflon film bags is we discovered a few years ago that the compounds that are formed in these chambers can readily partition into the Teflon film. And so if one wants to understand the chemistry that's going on, you really have to keep that in mind, and in many cases account for it somehow in the studies that you do. And so what this is showing is a series of experiments where we added different compounds, as you can see across the top there, to the chamber and then allowed them to come to equilibrium with the walls, which happens in time scales of roughly maybe 10 minutes to an hour, depending on the compound. And then this shows the fraction in the gas phase relative to the total amount of compound. And so what you can see is if you start out there with sort of pure hydrocarbons, the blue points at the end, alkanes and alkenes, once you get above maybe C12 or 13, you can start to get some partitioning into the walls for those. As you add functional groups to the molecule, which is the species moving closer to me, you can see that the partitioning into the walls happens at even smaller carbon numbers because these molecules are even less volatile. And so, as an example, then you'd look at a diol, a C8 diol, essentially all of it ends up in the walls. And so there's an enormous range of partitioning behaviors that one observes in these systems, and we just need to keep this in account when we're trying to quantify anything. And so one of the first compounds we wanted to look at then was alkyl nitrates, which I showed was one of the first products formed in this chemistry. And we're interested, right, for aerosol formation, we tend to be interested in higher molecular weight compounds because those are the ones that are most likely to form low volatility products. And so there was some work that had been done by Roger Atkinson and Janet Aries groups, and they had measured up to about C10, or C8, C10 there, the alkyl nitrate yields, but not beyond that. But they had developed a model based on essentially stabilization of the intermediate species that's formed in alkyl nitrate formation that suggested that the yield should plateau out at around 30% if you go out to larger carbon numbers. But this had never really been looked at. And so we knew that partitioning was going to be an issue here to the walls. And so we did a series of experiments where we synthesized these various types of alkyl nitrates, added them to the chamber, and then measured how much would go into the walls. And what's shown here is going from, just for these, all of these have the nitrate group in the 2 position, and it's then looking at C8 through C14 here. And you see for the lighter ones, they're essentially all in the gas phase, but then as you increase the carbon number, a larger fraction of the molecule will partition to the walls. And by this time, it's more than 80%. And then we did the same thing looking at different isomers of the C12s. And again, you see the sort of partitioning behavior we observed. And then we combined all of this data into a structure-activity relationship that we could use to predict their partitioning. And then we measured the aerosol, or the alkyl nitrate yields. And so those are the red points. And so as you can see, there's a rapid drop-off in the sort of measured yield, so to speak, uncorrected measured yield, because of the partitioning to the walls. But after we make corrections, which are the blue points, using that partitioning data I showed you, you can see the points fit pretty nicely with this modeled curve that Janet Aries and Roger had developed. And so with that, we had, we could at least place a number on the yield of alkyl nitrates for these reactions of higher molecular weight alkanes of roughly about 30%. And so then we wanted to look at hydroxynitrate yields, which are, again, one of the major components. And in that case, we actually take the opposite approach to what we did here, which is we take advantage of the fact that for the carbon numbers we're interested in, which is, again, sort of this C12 to 15 or so range, those molecules, because of the extra hydroxyl group, have such low vapor pressures that they'll be entirely in the particles. And so there then what we do is we collect the particles on filters, and so we've measured the hydroxynitrate yields. This is measured with liquid chromatography. And so what you can see is for small carbon, so what's being measured here is only what's collected on a filter. And so at small carbon numbers, we collect almost nothing because they're all in the gas phase and then probably have gone to the walls as well. But if we go up to high enough carbon numbers, you see a rapid increase here as more of the compound has partitioned into the particles, and so we collect it and can analyze it. And you can see then up around C15 or so, we hit this plateau where we're essentially, all of the compound is in the particles, and so we're able to measure all of it up at those numbers. And so that allows us then to put a yield on these of roughly around 13% or so. All right, so two totally different approaches to trying to quantify, which try to account in some way for these wall effects, or at least to avoid them when we can. And so with that, we could put, going back to this mechanism, we can put a number here of about 30%, roughly 13. Arian Atkinson and some others had shown that for these linear alkanes, there is no decomposition of the parent molecule, and so the carbonyl yield's essentially zero. And so by difference, we'd say that the hydroxycarbonyls are about 50, 57, roughly 60%. And actually, Roger and Janet have looked at the yield of that for octane and came up with a value about 62%. So it's all, our results as well as theirs are very sort of self-consistent in this way. And so it gives us a pretty simple picture of the chemistry for these compounds, where we're essentially making just 3 products, and we know more or less what the yields are. However, it turns out that things aren't quite as simple as that, because it turns out once these hydroxycarbonyls enter the aerosol, they can undergo some heterogeneous multiphase chemistry. And so what happens is that these can cyclize. So essentially what's happening here is this hydrogen's moving over to this oxygen, and the oxygen's binding to that carbon. So we make this 5-membered ring, and that compound then can dehydrate. And these are acid catalyzed reactions to make this dihydrofuran, so this unsaturated molecule, which is extremely reactive and is also more volatile, and so escapes from the particles back into the gas phase, where it can react again with OH and O2 and whatnot to make various products. And I should just point out that this is actually a really interesting reaction, because one would typically think of alkane chemistry as simply being OH chemistry. But because of the fact that these dihydrofurans can be formed, it opens up the chemistry for reactions with ozone or with NO3 radicals, which can only happen really to any significant extent when you have double bonds present, right? And so we wanted to look into this chemistry in more detail, and so we did some kinetic studies where we created these compounds in the absence of nitric acid. So nitric acid is the catalyst in the reactions I just showed you, because it's formed through the NOx chemistry that's going on. And so we needed to make some of these same compounds in the absence of NOx, so that we could add known amounts of nitric acid to be able to look at the kinetics. And so we made these from C15 alkane, so from pentadecane, again with some seed particles, added known amounts of nitric acid. And then we made OH radicals from the reaction at tetramethylethyene with ozone, which makes OH in yields of roughly 100%, and the reaction is extremely fast. So essentially on the mixing time scale of the chamber, that reaction occurs. And so what one sees when we monitor these with our particle mass spectrometer, essentially this is the only product we see in the particles. So the hydroxycarbonyls that are initially formed essentially immediately cyclize when they reach a particle. But then the subsequent reaction where that cyclic form dehydrates is the slow and rate determining step. And so we've monitored that, again, just using these peaks, and then we've measured the mass of aerosol that's formed, and we measure the nitric acid or nitrate, whichever form it's in the particles using ion chromatography. So you can see the decay curves there, which show increasing decay as we add more nitric acid into the system. And so we're interested in knowing what exactly is the catalytic process going on. So there's two possibilities. One is that it's catalyzed by protons, and the other is that it's catalyzed by just molecular nitric acid. And so this is sort of the standard mechanism one would see from any kind of organic chemistry textbook about the proton-catalyzed dehydration of alcohols, where you have this quick protonation of the molecule, a slow dehydration process, and then a fast loss of the regeneration of the proton. And what's important about this is if one writes down a rate law for this, it includes an acid dissociation constant for the nitric acid and a Henry's law constant for uptake of molecular nitric acid into the particles. So you can write down the overall rate constant as a combination of these various constants times the gas phase nitric acid concentration as a square root, right? If instead one looks at the molecular catalysis process, it turns out that again, you have this group of constants, but it goes linearly with the nitric acid concentration. So by looking at the kinetic plots, we can determine what the catalysis is that's going on. And so if we plot the rate constants that we extract from those decay curves against the gas phase nitric acid concentration, you can see we have a nice linear relationship that's indicating that, in fact, the reaction's catalyzed by molecular nitric acid, not protons, in fact, which is the opposite of what we expected going into this. But it maybe shouldn't be too surprising because these reactions are done under very dry conditions, so there's not much water around to hydrolyze the acid. The other thing, and so this is plotting it just versus gas phase nitric acid. We can also plot the rate constants versus the amount of nitric acid and nitrate that's in the particles. And again, it's a linear relationship. So what this means is that we can then just plot essentially the x-axes against each other to get a Henry's law constant for the uptake of nitric acid into secondary organic aerosol, which is something that hasn't previously been available. And so when we plot the amount in the particles versus the gas phase, we get this linear relationship, which, however, because the nitric acid can dissociate into nitrate or to stay in the molecular form, this equation in general could be expected to have this form where there's actually two terms. A linear term that's linear, the nitric acid, it's related to the Henry's law constant, and then another term that would go as the square root that includes both the acid dissociation constant and Henry's law constant. So if you look at this, it's obvious this looks pretty linear, and so this second term appears to be quite small. And so in fact, if we extract from this curve, we can get that the Henry's law constant for uptake of molecular nitric acid into the particles is as shown here, roughly 4 times 10 to the 4 in these units. And interestingly, it's almost the same as water, right? But this is when you're talking about nitric acid partitioning into water as a molecule and doesn't account for the dissociation part, which is what's captured in the acid dissociation constant. And so in this case, the acid dissociation constant for nitric acid in organic aerosol is roughly 10 to the minus 3 or less, whereas in water it would be 15. So the reason there's so much nitric acid in water, why it's so soluble, is because it almost all dissociates, right? More than 99%. In this aerosol, very little of the nitric acid actually dissociates, and so that's why in this case the reaction is catalyzed by molecules, not by protons. Right? So with this, we have a fairly good understanding then of sort of the molecular level details of this reaction, where we know the particular product yield from the gas phase, and we also know what happens with regards to this multiphase chemistry. So for the rest of the talk, what I want to talk about is essentially aerosol yields and how this sort of plays out, how these structural effects will end up playing out in those measurements. And so this is, again, our linear alkane system, and so what I'm showing is for the reaction of pentadecane, and so the C15, actually this is C16, and these are thermal desorption profiles. So what you can see in here is here's the alkyl nitrate that comes out, the hydroxynitrate, which is somewhat less volatile, comes out later. Here's our sort of low volatility seed particles, and then most of the products are here and are associated with this cyclization, dehydration, subsequent chemistry that goes on. Right? And so if we look at the aerosol yields that we get for a series of these alkanes of increasing carbon number, what one sees is this nice smoothly increasing curve. And so at C7, there's essentially no aerosol formed, and then by the time we get up to C17 out there, it's approaching a yield of 1. And so this makes sort of perfect sense in that the chemistry of all these alkanes is more or less the same. Similar products are being formed, but the volatility is then being mostly influenced by the parent carbon number. And so as we increase the carbon number, we lower the volatility of the product, so we make more aerosol. In addition to that, with our mass spectrometer, we can look at what's the primary composition of the aerosol that's being formed in these different experiments. And what we see that is at low carbon number, it's more or less dominated by this part of the sort of product distribution, which makes sense because these have the most functional groups on them, and this is a small carbon number, so you need to have that in order to get things to partition into the aerosol. On the other hand, if we go out to high enough carbon numbers, we can see that around 15 or 16, we start to see even monofunctional compounds, alkyl nitrates, being present in the particles out at that far end. So this is sort of consistent with the classical picture that one has of secondary organic aerosol formation based on product volatility. But what's interesting is if we switch from just these simple linear molecules to branched ones, where we start moving carbons around. I'll show you some structures in a second so that there are methyl groups hanging off and things like that. We see that in general, the yields for branched alkanes are always lower than they are for linear molecules. And so one can in fact explain this by going back to this original mechanism. I've eliminated some pieces that aren't necessary here. But basically, we again make alkyl nitrates. We can get to these alkoxy radicals. But now the important point is that once we add branching to the molecule, this decomposition pathway becomes significant. And so prior to this, all we were doing was adding functional groups during the chemistry. And so we were making lots of aerosol. But now once we start breaking the carbon chain up, we make less. And so we can still make these other products, but we have this other pathway then that's open and bleeding off products. So if we look at a series of C12 alkanes with these structures, all right, so all with nominally the same vapor pressure more or less, but just different positions where the carbons are, what one sees is that the aerosol yields drop from roughly 40% down to almost 0 as we just by moving things around on the carbon chain. And so again, it's just the fact that the increased branching increases decomposition rates of alkoxy radicals. And so in fact, one can estimate this using some methods from Vrieken and Peters. And so I've plotted out, or I'm showing here the ratio of the decomposition rate constant versus isomerization for these different structures, right, where you're going from essentially no branching to highly branched. And you see that this changes from a negligible value, and so one would expect full isomerization, to down here to a value where you would expect full decomposition for that sort of structure. So the yields that we see for these molecules is simply based on changes to the isomer structure. we can also look at the effect, what happens when you have a ring. And so it turns out then, again, I've plotted in blue the linear molecules and then the cyclic up here. So these are just single rings. There's no branching going from C6 up to C15. And what you see in this case, the yields are all higher than the linear ones are. And so the reason for this, I think, has to do with the fact that there's ring strain that depends on the ring size. One thing you can notice here is that differences between linear and cyclic tend to approach each other at the extremes here. And it's really in between that you see the largest differences. And so, in fact, if one looks at ring strain, it tends to be a maximum in this range and then decrease as one goes to smaller or larger ones. And so, again, that's consistent. And the reason that whether or not there's strain is that when there is strain for this sort of alkoxy radical, it'll lead to decomposition, whereas in a linear molecule, we would simply have this as the first sort of radical product, whereas in this case, our first product already has a functional group on it. And so it's going to end up with a lower volatility than you would in the linear case. So again, totally consistent with what's happening to alkoxy radicals. And then the last thing I want to touch on is some more recent work that we've done. So as these molecules are reacting and functional groups are being added, those functional groups also will affect the subsequent chemistry. And so we wanted to look at two of the major functional groups that one sees, which are carbonyl groups and hydroxyl groups, to see how that would affect aerosol yields. And so this is an interesting question because offhand, there's two things one could imagine happening. In one case, where if we compare for a particular alkane, if we add a carbonyl or a hydroxyl group, that will lower the vapor pressure. And so if that sort of gets carried through all the chemistry, you'd expect to make more aerosol because your parent compound is less volatile. On the other hand, depending on how that functional group affects alkoxy radical decomposition, you might expect to make less aerosol. And so there's sort of some competing issues here that one needs to do experiments to figure out what actually happens. And so in this case then, essentially the key part is when we get to here, and if we have a functional group adjacent to that alkoxy group, that can enhance decomposition in the same way that branching did for those various alkanes that I was showing you. And that would tend to lead to less aerosol. Alternatively, we would just go on and make these highly functionalized products that would make aerosol. So if we look at our mass spectra, the first thing we've noticed, so these are particle beam mass spectra of the aerosol formed from these different isomers. So we're looking at where the carbonyl group is in the 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6 position. And these are all for C12. And if you look at these, you tend to see that they all look the same. And so this is maybe not too surprising. We're looking at very similar molecules. And at least at this level, the products that are present in the aerosol appear to be the same things in all cases. Right? And the same thing holds for the alcohols. Right? This one actually looks quite a bit different, but the reason for that has to do with how electron ionization affects that particular type of alcohol compared to the others. And so the point of both of these is essentially that, at least at this mass spectral level, it looks like all the compounds are making all the ketones make the same products, all the alcohols make the same products. But then, if we look at how much aerosol is formed, we see that it depends dramatically on the position of that carbonyl group. And so this is kind of a busy slide, but what's plotted here, so this is the aerosol yield versus the position of that carbonyl group on the molecule. So this is closest to the end, and that's towards the middle. And then there's 3 lines across here. So the blue line is the aerosol yield for tetradecane, the C14 alkane, and so these are sort of to serve as references. And the red one is for dodecane. And so this is essentially for just the carbon backbone without any carbonyl group added to it. And And tetradecane has a vapor pressure very similar to what the this 2-dodecanone does. And so, for instance, if we look out here, so these are vapor pressures here. So this is 1.1, here it's 1.9. It's roughly the same thing. So the important point here is that if we look at this particular isomer, it has a vapor pressure, the parent has a vapor pressure very similar to tetradecane, and it also forms about the same amount of aerosol. So the aerosol yield essentially sort of scales with the vapor pressure of the parent. But as we move towards the middle of the molecule, we see that the aerosol yields decrease. And so the way we interpret this is essentially when the functional group's on the end, it can't sort of mess with the chemistry, right? And because it's out of the way. And so its role in affecting alkoxy radical chemistry is very minimal. But when it's out more towards the middle of the molecule, it can affect alkoxy radical sort of formation and decomposition either at the initial stages when abstraction first occurs or during isomerizations and whatnot. And as a result of that, it tends to lead to more fragmentation and so dramatically reduced yield. So this is pretty surprising that just by moving the functional group across the carbon chain, the aerosol yield changes by a factor of 3. Right? And more or less the same thing happens for the alcohols. More or less the same interpretation, where when the functional group's on the end, you see a yield that's very close to what you would get for a corresponding alkane with the same vapor pressure. But then as you move towards the middle, it decreases significantly, again, due to the decomposition process. There's also, you might notice this little jump here, and which actually can be explained again about this isomerization. It has to do with the fact that the functional group's in the 5 position, it affects isomerization rates, and when it's in the 6th position, it allows the molecule to sort of go the other direction, kind of avoid that functional group. Sort of a subtlety, but we understand why that happens. So we can essentially explain these results simply based on the branching between alkoxy radicals decomposing and isomerizing. And so with that, I'll end and just summarize and say that, I think from this you can see that there are very strong structural effects of molecules on their tendency to form aerosol during this sort of chemistry. And that it depends, in truth, not only on the particular organic structure, but also the oxidant. And these effects are both due to the volatility of the parent compound as well as the subsequent chemistry, and in particular, how it affects alkoxy radicals is sort of the key intermediate. And then I'd just like to point out that I showed a little bit of sort of multiphase chemistry here through this dehydration process sort of thing. But there's lots of other reactions that can happen in particles. And this is sort of one of the things I think people working in this field would agree is a major unknown and a real challenge to deal with in terms of trying to understand aerosol formation. So with that, I'd be happy to answer any questions. Thank you.
On the question of the yields from the cyclic versus non-cyclic alkanes, you said a major reason is the strain energy in the cyclic compounds. But I'm wondering if a major other reason is that when you break the bond next to the alkoxy radical in a cyclic compound, you haven't really broken the molecule. You still have the full length. While if it's a straight alkane, you break it into 2 pieces.
Yes, that's right. Yeah, that's a good point.
I'm curious about the secondary peak in the thermal desorption slide that you showed. Do you have an explanation for that? Is there like a technical thing or there is physics?
These ones?
Yeah, right there. You see that the high volatile ones, yeah, they have 2 peaks, and they all have kind of 2 or 3 peaks.
Yeah, so I think what this is meaning is that both the hydroxynitrate and the alkyl nitrate have the 225 as a mass fragment, is what that's saying. And that's actually easily explained based on how they would fragment.
So
it's
those
not
are
showing that
fragments
there's sort of another. So it's just saying that for this hydroxynitrate, it gives an ion at 229, it gives an ion at 225.
All right, so it's just
an ion,
trivial
yeah.
fragmentation.
So it's not, it just has to do with the fragmentation pattern. Yeah.
Hey, Paul. Hey, I should probably read Lucas's paper, but digging a little deeper on the last one you showed, the ketones and hydroxys. So do you have any information on the site of attack buried in there? Just thinking about activation down the chain.
Oh, so you mean with regards to our interpretation of those, you mean?
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I took out a slide because I thought it was too complicated, but we did some, Luke did some calculations for these different molecules, calculated using structure activity, Atkinson and then Vriek and Peters stuff, for where abstraction would be occurring. And in ketones, it's 2 sites away, right, where it's activated, and then calculating for each of those how much would then, after calculating what fraction of the OH is going to occur at each site, how much will lead to decomposition, how much isomerization. And, it gets pretty messy because the effect of the functional groups that I tried to point out appears at the initial stage when you do the first abstraction. But also you can end up isomerizing and pulling from the hydrogen right next to the functional group. And then that alkoxy radical can decompose. And so you have a bunch of different things that can happen. But it turns out that if you go through that, what he did, and you just look at what are how do the isomerization products, their yields, look with carbon number, it looks just like this. And it even captures this increase. And so I think it's pretty consistent with that. It would be a nice system to look at with Gecko, which has all this in more detail.
Seems like at some point you can get alkoxy isomerization from both sides.
Yes.
Of the initial attack, and that's when the field that's what that's up.
Yeah.
Well, if you're progressively coming in from one side, you can only do it on one
Then
side.
you just go, yeah. Yeah.
Great, thanks.
Does that answer your question? Yeah, it does. Okay.
I'll definitely look more closely at the paper.
Okay, yeah.
Any more questions?
Question actually about the sensitivity to NOx. These are high NOx
Yeah.
experiments, but if you are thinking about the urban air mass going over like a more cleaner air, you say this lifetime is 1 day or so. So do you think this is some perturbation to the system if you consider lower NOx regimes?
So you mean if you went into a different regime like
In terms of lower NOx, so if you change the NOx.
HO2 chemistry and RO2s and all that? Yeah, I don't think I don't know if we know enough about RO2, RO2 rate constants or RO2, HO2s for multifunctional things. Maybe that's a little harder to predict quite how things would happen. I'm not sure you guys thought about this.
Well, let me put it this
I mean-
way. You're right, very hard to predict, and I think Gecko is coming back at you guys, and we need some measurements to improve the...
We'll try to do that, yeah. So it'd be interesting to do these under low NOx conditions, right? To see how that might differ.
You're very tempted to take this into the 3D model, say, okay, this is
Right, yeah.
but yeah, I don't know.
No, you're right. It's just that high NOx experiments are so much easier than low NOx ones. Yeah.
I was just going to comment that the number of reactions and complexity means we have a lot of work to do still.
Yeah. It's probably simpler than what Sasha talked about a couple weeks ago.
Yeah. Any more questions? Okay, well, let's thank Paul again.